Hello, everybody.
Hello.
The meeting held tonight is a public meeting held under the Planning Act. Notice of collection, personal information collected as a result of the public meetings are collected under the authority of the Planning Act and will be used to assist in making a decision on this matter. Persons speaking at the meeting are requested to give their name and address for the recording of the minutes. All names, addresses, opinions, and comments will be collected and may form part of the minutes, which will be available to the public. Additionally, interested members of the public can email the committee clerk or the assigned planner if they wish to be notified regarding a particular application. Questions regarding this collection should be forwarded to the Director of Planning Services. Tonight's meeting is to consider public meeting reports. These reports do contain a staff recommendation, and the recommendation is typically to approve with conditions or deny. After the planning presentation, committee members will be able to ask questions of staff, followed by members of the public, following a question and answer period. This committee then makes a recommendation on the application to City Council, who has the final say on the applications. Following Council decision, notice will be circulated in accordance to the Planning Act. If a person or public body would otherwise have an ability to appeal the decision of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston to the Ontario Land Tribunal, but the person or public body does not make an oral submission at the public meeting or make written submission to the City of Kingston before the bylaw is passed, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. So, what time is it? So I'll call the meeting to order, the public meeting to order at 6:04 p.m. So do I have a mover and seconder for the agenda as amended? Moved by Councillor Shaves, seconded by Councillor Oosterhoff. Is there any discussion? All in favor? That passes. So can I have a mover and seconder for confirming the minutes of meeting number 16-2024? Moved by Councillor Rosanek, seconded by Councillor Shaves. All in favor? Or is there any discussion? Or anything you want to change? No? All in favor? That passes. Okay, so are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing as none, we have no delegations and there are no briefings this evening, so we'll move on to business. So the recommendation report for growth allocation by sub-area and future urban boundary expansion review. I invite staff to introduce the report.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair, members of the Planning Committee, and members of the public. My name is Sukriti Agarwal, and I'm the Manager of Policy Planning with the Planning Services Department. I'm joined here by Jamie Cook, who is attending virtually over Zoom. Jamie is the Managing Partner with Watson & Associates Economists Limited. We are here to speak to report number PC 24-051 about the population, housing, and employment growth allocations by sub-areas in the city and a future urban boundary expansion review. Before we begin the presentation, I just wanted to mention that there were a couple of typos in Exhibit A of report PC 24-051. The student population growth from 2021 to 2051, not captured in the census, was written as 4,600. It should have been 6,400 on pages 2 in the executive summary and 9-3 in the conclusions. Additionally, page 3-10 indicated that 31% of the students are not captured in the 2021 census. This number should have been 51%. We will be making these corrections at the time this report goes to council. None of this affects any of the information that is being presented tonight or any of the growth projections that were previously approved by council. These were just typos that happened in the report. So as part of the preparation of the official plan, there were key background studies that were initiated by planning services to support a long-term growth analysis and urban land needs assessment for the city, as shown on the slide. The first of these studies was the population, housing, and employment growth forecast to the year 2051, which was endorsed by Council on December 5th, 2023. The growth projections that were endorsed by Council indicated that the city is anticipated to grow by about 67,000 new residents by the year 2051, 29,300 new housing units, and 33,400 new jobs by the year 2051. Mr. Cook will be providing an overview of this growth forecast in the next few slides. So informed by this growth forecast, we, along with the Watson team, worked on a series of reports which reviewed the land needs assessment to accommodate this growth to the year 2051. So the community area land needs assessment and intensification analysis report was presented to Council on August 13th, 2024. The employment area land needs was presented on September 3rd, 2024, and the commercial land review and strategic directions was presented on September 17th of 2024, and all of these reports have now been endorsed by Council. So in a nutshell, what these reports have indicated is that the city has a shortfall of about 745 hectares of lands within its urban boundary to accommodate future residential growth, future commercial growth, future employment growth, and also uses such as institutional uses, parks, and open spaces that are needed to support that housing forecast. The report that's in front of you tonight includes an allocation of this anticipated growth to various sub-areas in the city. So these are Kingston North, Kingston West, Kingston Central, and Kingston East. And all of this work is intended to inform the city's new official plan. The report tonight also presents a proposed approach for an urban boundary expansion review, which will be undertaken as part of the official plan project. And with that, I will pass it over to Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Sukriti, and good evening, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you tonight about the findings of our growth allocations work. Before we get into the details of the allocations, I just wanted to provide a few slides just to recap on the key findings of the citywide growth analysis. So we'll start off with the employment forecast, and the citywide analysis that I'm going to be summarizing tonight is consistent with the forecast that was prepared and presented to Council on December 5th of 2023. And the report that accompanies this presentation is also consistent with those details. So with respect to the employment forecast, we prepared 3 long-term scenarios for employment growth out to the year 2051. And we've identified a recommended employment forecast of just under 114,000 jobs by 2051. That's an increase of about 33,500 jobs over that 28-year period. It represents about a doubling in the annual employment growth rate across the city relative to historical trends that were experienced over the 96 to 2021 period. Next slide. So in addition to the overall forecast by total employment, we've also prepared a breakdown of employment growth by major sector and also subsector, and by land use category. So these are the overall major sectors that we've identified. Within the city of Kingston, we've identified about 31% of the growth in commercial and population-related employment categories. So this is commercial, retail, and other uses that are related to the commercial and office sector. You would have heard more details about this at Council on Tuesday. And then we've also identified about just under a third of the employment growth in the institutional category. This is largely healthcare and education and other institutional sectors. In addition, we've identified 22% of the jobs in the industrial category and about 16% in work at home and no fixed place of work employment. Next slide. So moving on to the employment forecast, this is a summary of the total employment forecast, including students out to the year 2051. And again, we've identified the medium scenario being the preferred scenario or the recommended scenario for long-term planning purposes. We've identified a total population forecast of 221,000 by 2051. This represents an increase of about just under 67,000 people. So just want to be clear as well, within this forecast, This also includes census non-permanent residents, so international students and others that are currently residing in the city that are in the city on a temporary visa as a temporary resident are included in the permanent population forecast. This is a methodology that we've adopted from Statistics Canada and how Statistics Canada records and captures population within municipalities. So that additional non-permanent resident population represents just under 7,000 additional people that we've identified for growth to the year 2051. We've also identified post-secondary students that are not captured in the census at about 6,400, as Sukriti mentioned, and that is also in addition to that is in addition to the permanent population. So that is the key difference here is in this slide is identifying that permanent plus students, and there's also students in the base to give us this total number. And we've identified a total of about 2,300 additional housing units that would be required to capture these students that are not captured in the census. Next slide. So moving on to the permanent population forecast, we've again identified 3 long-term scenarios, and we've recommended the medium scenario as the scenario for long-term planning purposes. That forecast identifies a total permanent population of 197,000 people by 2051. It represents an annual growth rate of about 1.2%. That's not quite double the historical growth rate from the last 20 years, which was about 0.7%. But it is a significant increase in total population. I would note that even though we are experiencing and anticipate to continue to experience significant population growth in the city, a 1.2% growth rate is still lower than the provincial average, which is 1.5%, and even lower than the Eastern Ontario average, which is also 1.5%. That Eastern Ontario number being upwardly driven largely because of the high growth rate for the city of Ottawa. Next slide. And so building on that population forecast, we prepared a housing forecast, again out to 2051 in 5-year increments, and we've identified a total increase of about 27,000 permanent households to accommodate that forecast of population to 2051. That represents about 900 additional permanent households a year, which is about a 50% increase relative to the historical trends that we've experienced over the last 25 years. Next slide. So this slide just provides a bit more detail of the incremental housing growth by 5-year periods by structure type. And so again, we've identified 900 units over that long-term period. But over the shorter-term period, we are identifying higher growth, reflecting current demand, anticipated development and development approvals, and looking at the overall projections for real estate trends in the next 5 to 10 years. We are identifying a higher rate of growth. And then we do anticipate some moderate decline in that rate of growth over time. We expect that the population growth rate will slow down over time as the population continues to age, and as the labor force ages, we do expect some slowing in growth rates, both demographically and economically. I wanted to point out that over the 10-year period, when you include the higher growth that we identified, as well as additional households that are not captured in the permanent forecast, including additional housing to accommodate students, additional housing to accommodate those that are that have housing needs that have been identified through the housing needs assessment study. It actually brings our forecast up to about 1,400 units a year. So comparably to the housing pledge of 8,000 units and the mayor's near-term housing targets, we are higher in both accounts. With respect to the mix, you can see we're identifying a shift in the housing mix. You can see the high density in the orange, medium density in light blue, and low density in dark blue. Over time, we do expect to see a greater shift towards more high density development within the city. We are anticipating and we are recommending a higher rate of residential intensification, as I indicated back in August to council, of 60%. We're also anticipating a more balanced mix of housing in new greenfield areas, driven largely by declining housing affordability, and demographic trends within the city over the long term. So over the long-term period, we've identified just over 50%, about 54% of the housing being high density, and then 20% low density and 26% medium density. Next slide. So this just provides a summary of those forecasts that I just went through for reference. I don't think there's a need to go over those numbers again, so they're here and summarized in this page for reference. Now I wanted to get into the allocation discussion. So on this next slide, I first wanted to just point out the level of geography that we've looked at here as part of this allocation exercise. So the first level of geography was the policy area level, the planning policy area level. That is and we talked about this in the August presentation to council, looking at the urban structure within the city. We've identified growth within built up areas, and then we've identified growth in designated greenfield areas and rural. So that is the first allocation exercise that was undertaken. And as I mentioned, we've identified 60% of the housing growth to occur annually on average within the built up area over the forecast period. We've also broken down the growth by sub area. So this work is used to help further inform other planning decision making, as well as support decision making with made by Utilities Kingston. So as a key organization that would be utilizing the results of this work. So the first is a breakdown of growth by sub area, which is broken down by Kingston North, Kingston East, Kingston Central, and Kingston West. And then we've also broken the growth down, or allocated the growth by water and wastewater catchment area, including Central, West, Canada with water only. However, there's no growth identified in that area, as well as the rural areas with no servicing. So the next slide just provides a bit of a breakdown or discussion about the factors that are taken into consideration when we do a growth allocation like this one. So we look at both supply and demand factors when we're considering the allocation of growth by sub-area. So on the supply side, we've looked at supply potential of housing and active development approvals. We've looked at the inventory of vacant designated urban greenfield lands that are currently not in the development approvals process but are available for development within the existing urban boundary. On the non-residential side, we also had discussions with staff regarding non-residential development potential. We considered servicing of available lands, both residential and employment lands. We also considered long-term capacity for services based on discussions with city staff and Utilities Kingston. We worked with Dillon Consulting to undertake a detailed assessment of residential intensification opportunities, and we also looked through our own analysis at non-residential intensification opportunities. And then lastly, we also considered this within the framework of the current or the proposed, is now the final provincial policy statement, provincial planning statement, I should say, will be in effect as of October the 20th. So that was the final item we looked at on the supply side. On the demand side, on the next slide, we undertook a review of local development activity, looking at residential building permits by structure type over the last 20 years. We also looked at census data and looking at housing, employment, and population trends over a 20-year period at a minimum by these sub-areas. We considered historical employment trends. We reviewed established and emerging employment clusters, as well as non-residential activity and recent absorption rates in industrial areas. We also considered Kingston's overall role within the broader regional economy and how commuting trends are anticipated to influence employment opportunities and population growth within various areas of the municipality. We reviewed local employment opportunities. We assessed market demand for residential intensification over the near, medium, and long term. And we also took a detailed investigation of demographic and socioeconomic trends, including those of permanent residents and students, as well as all ages of the current population to assess their needs for population and housing and how those needs influence the location patterns of development. So the next slide just provides a map of these areas for your reference. So this is a map of the sub-area boundaries with the central area identified in blue, the west area identified in the maroon color. We've identified the east, Kingston East in orange, and North Kingston in green. And then you can see within that map is the dotted line is the outline of the city's existing urban boundary. So you can see all the lands that are outside of that yellow line would represent the rural area of the city. So on the next slide, this provides a summary of the breakdown of growth by geographic area for population and employment. You can see here that the trends for population and employment are relatively consistent. We've identified about 41% of the population growth in Kingston West, 34% in Kingston Central, and 23% in Kingston East, with about 2% in Kingston North. The employment allocations are quite similar, as you can see, in terms of the overall percentage allocations. And then on the right, you can see a table that summarizes that forecast in terms of the absolute growth over that 30-year period. Next slide. So this just provides a summary of the water service catchment area boundaries. Similar to the sub-area analysis, but distinct to areas that are serviced by water, looking at central in the blue, the west catchment area in the maroon color, and east in the orange, again, showing the outline of the urban boundary within those water catchment areas. And then we also took a review of the wastewater catchment areas, which is summarized on the next slide. Again, a similar map, but specifically showing where areas are serviced with water services, municipal water services. Next slide. So similar to the forecast by sub-area, the water and wastewater catchment area forecast is essentially very similar to the sub-area analysis, with about 41% of the permanent population identified in the west catchment area, 34% in the central catchment area, and 22% in the east catchment area, and about 3% in the rural area. Next slide. So I'm going to pass it back over to Sukriti, who's going to provide an overview of the urban boundary expansion review.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. So as Mr. Cook mentioned, we are looking at accommodating a lot of growth in Kingston West, Kingston Central, and Kingston East, and a small percentage of the growth in the rural area. Kingston East and Kingston West, as was previously shown on the mapping, it includes both urban areas and rural areas. As I mentioned previously, the city will need to expand its urban boundary by approximately 745 hectares to accommodate long-term housing, population, commercial, and employment needs. So staff at this point in time have identified a very broad brush study area for the future urban boundary expansion. This area is shown in gray on this map. It's contiguous to our existing urban boundary in both Kingston East and Kingston West, south of the 401. These lands are approximately 2,700 hectares in area, so it's a lot more land that we actually need. However, staff have developed a set of criteria, and we are going to narrow down this study area to the actual candidate sites for future inclusion in the urban boundary. I just wanted to mention that as per the new provincial planning statement that is coming into effect on October 20th, at the time of creating a new official plan or each official plan update, municipalities are required to provide sufficient land to accommodate an appropriate range and mix of land uses to meet projected needs for a time horizon of 20 to 30 years. At this point in time, it is anticipated that the new official plan will be presented to Council for consideration in 2026. And through all of this work that has been completed by Watson and Associates, we are looking at a time horizon of 2051. So that is 25 years. So we are within the timeline that's prescribed by the province. In order to review candidate sites to be included in a future urban boundary expansion, like I mentioned, staff have come up with local criteria. There is criteria that is included in the provincial planning statement as well with respect to urban boundary expansions. But with respect to criteria that we have developed, that includes consideration of lands that are contiguous to the existing urban boundary, so we are not leapfrogging development. Consideration of land use compatibility, exclusion of any significant natural heritage features from the developable area so that these features are protected over the long term, exclusion of any prime agricultural areas, proximity and convenient access to Highway 401 for industrial uses for the purposes of goods movement, appropriate phasing. When the new official plan comes into effect, and provided that the urban boundary expansion moves forward through council and through the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, not all of those lands will be available for development right away. So we will have to come up with some type of a phasing plan which will identify which lands will be serviced first with utility infrastructure and also road network. We are also looking at the creation of complete communities and complete neighborhoods so that residents are able to find needs locally. And I wanted to thank Councillor Shaves for recommending the complete neighborhoods terminology. And then we will also be considering any potential impacts to built heritage resources. And I wanted to mention, as previously has been noted out through previous staff reports, the city has received interest from private landowners for inclusion of their lands within the urban boundary. So these are anticipated to come in as formal official plan amendment applications later in October, early November. So staff will be reviewing all of these applications. These will be going through a technical review process. It is possible that we may have to look at additional sites because the interest that we have received so far is less, amounts to less lands that the city actually needs to be able to accommodate the projected growth forecast. And as I mentioned, based on this criteria, we will be narrowing down the urban boundary study area to those candidate sites for inclusion in a future urban boundary. There will be multiple opportunities for public engagement through the official plan project. So all of this work, like I mentioned, is going to happen through the official plan work. In terms of the recommendation that's included within the staff report, staff are requesting that council endorse the allocation of the population, housing, and employment growth forecast within the Kingston East, Kingston West, Kingston Central, and Kingston North sub-areas as presented in Exhibit A to report number PC 24-051. And that concludes our presentation. We are happy to take questions and comments.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Questions from committee, Councillor Rosenik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My one question is about expanding into Mayo Square Block, which is the property to the west, and how the timing of moving the urban growth boundary to Coronation Boulevard, including all of Mayo Square Block, is going to coincide with finishing the natural heritage study.
Through you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that question, Councillor Rosanek. So I'm just going to switch over to that map. So this is just a study area. At this point in time, staff still need to undertake a review of the sites that will be recommended for inclusion in a future urban boundary. Like I mentioned, this area is a lot more than we actually need. So It is possible that the urban boundary will not be expanded all the way to the boundary with Loyalist Township, which is Coronation Boulevard here. But in terms of the timing of the natural heritage study, that will be completed prior to the final recommendation on the official plan coming before council. So the natural heritage study is a background study to the official plan. And yes, it will be completed before. And all of that information will be taken into consideration when we make that recommendation.
Okay, thank you. So we'll be doing the natural heritage study will be finished before council gets a recommendation as to where the urban growth boundary, new boundaries will be set. Like we'll have the natural heritage study first.
Correct. And the
Okay.
natural heritage study will also be coming to council for
Perfect.
endorsement. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Usarov.
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Chair and everyone. I like, can you hear me well enough?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, good, sorry about that. So, yeah, a lot of good stuff and exciting stuff and a lot of, yeah, great planning. I like what I see for the most part and commend everybody involved. And I know that, that we should be in good hands as we move forward. I just wanted some clarity. Are the complete communities, would you be able to say where they might be, or what are you looking for? And when you do that, and or is it because of our size of city, is the entire city basically a complete community? You know, it kind of is. It's pretty small compared to bigger cities. So I don't necessarily see it. I know where Ottawa's is, and it's way out. And I don't understand it at all but they're going to have a city on their own in Ottawa, I believe. That's how I understand it. But for Kingston, I was just wondering if you could kind of give us a sense of where that, the complete community or neighborhoods would be, or do we see it as a whole?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So in terms of the complete communities and complete neighborhoods concept, we are really looking at the lands that will be brought forward within the urban boundary. So we are looking at a mix of uses in those areas, different densities of, different forms and densities of residential, including school blocks, including commercial areas, including some types of employment uses that may be compatible, that are compatible with residential uses. So it really also kind of jives with the 15-minute neighborhood concept. So that's really what we're looking to achieve. And I see Ms. Agnew's.
Commissioner Agnew.
Thank you. Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. Chair. The only thing I would add to Ms. Agarwal's response, which I completely agree with, is, you know, as we look at the rural lands councillor, and certainly we've had a number of conversations with you and some other rural stakeholders, and there will be many more to come. But it's not unusual for us to apply some of the general principles to some of the discussions we've had, particularly around the hamlet expansion and diversification of uses around the hamlets, just to provide some additional amenities to rural residents that specifically have been identified as lacking in terms of our conversation. So we'll be pursuing that in addition to the overall complete community concept that Ms. Agarwal and Mr. Cook have spoken to as part of the overall planning approach going forward.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that, Ms. Agnew, and I appreciate being involved in that and having those conversations. When I look at the balance of the expansion of the urban boundary, are you including the capacity considerations for water and wastewater? We recently had a tour, and I found it incredibly fascinating how really quite a good shape we're in, and we're very fortunate to be along the lake, of course, and the city is ideally positioned for growth. And but have you included utilities, Kingston, in that? Because it's fairly balanced. I mean, with what the map I see there, it makes a lot of sense. but I'm just curious about conversations and, obviously you're not going to make projections if it's not possible infrastructure-wise, but maybe you could let us know what the thought path was.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Councillor Oosterhoff, for that question. I didn't miss to mention during my presentation that Utilities Kingston is initiating their water and wastewater master plan. So we are going to be working very closely with Utilities Kingston on this urban boundary expansion with respect to capacity requirements going forward. And I also wanted to mention the integrated mobility plan that transportation services will be undertaking, which will look at these future expansion lands and the needs for any like road infrastructure, transit infrastructure, active transportation infrastructure improvements.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was my next, transit projections. I know that it's a pretty large increase. It's a pretty large capacity increase for transit as well, and as well as for water and wastewater. I guess I'm just asking, have we considered enough? Because I know we're not going to get water and wastewater north of the 401 anytime soon, but you can see that in 2050 we're going to reach, as far as we can go east or west, west, and perhaps we can go further east as time allows and as the picture unfolds. But I was wondering, when we do that, shouldn't you also have a tentative plan? Because now we know that our pipes are too small, but would there be a way of considering having the pipe sized for a percentage of growth post 2050? That needs to be considered, because north is going to likely have to be considered then as well. Is that enough? Is that possible to be that kind of futuristic?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So at this point in time, we are generally looking at south of the 401, but yes, that potential is definitely there. In the future, should Council direct staff to look at an expansion north of the 401 with respect to our services. I just wanted to mention that that will also require a lot of coordination with the Ministry of Transportation, as infrastructure facilities would have to cross the 401 to the north.
Yes.
Commissioner Agnew had a...
Oh, yes. Sorry. Go ahead, Ms. Agnew.
Oh, thank you. And just to add to what Ms. Agarwal had to say, Councillor, certainly, we're doing the long-term projections. We have relative levels of confidence with maybe 5 and 10 years out, but as we know, things can rapidly change. So we will continue to monitor the numbers. And as Sukriti was talking about, a really important part of all of this work, considering the amount of growth and urban boundary expansion that is being contemplated to get us to that 2051 state that we're projecting, really has to do with very smart phasing and staging of the infrastructure upgrades. And that's where our work with Utilities Kingston and that collaboration, and we're working in lockstep with them on this process, becomes incredibly important. Because as you say, if we start to grow faster or we grow faster than we expect, we would have the ability with some of that phasing strategy, depending on how we go, to be looking at those pipe sizes. And certainly there's always an amount in addition to what's expected. There's a buffer that's built into the design exercise, but that will be very closely and incrementally monitored going forward, even with the phasing strategy that we come forward. Because as you can appreciate, we can't grow in all directions at once. We just simply, from a human capacity and from a financial capacity, can't do it all at the same time. So we're going to have to come back to council and have some dedicated conversations about where we want to go first and how we do that, and what the strategy is around some of the financial management to do with those infrastructure upgrades. But with the ability to build in some buffers, certainly that's part of our conversations as we go along the way.
Yeah, that's through the chair. Thank you for that. Excuse me. Because I really, I think the past, we got to learn from the past as well. And I know about the financial implications to infrastructure, but I still feel in some ways that the North has been let down a little bit for the failure to have the vision or potential. And I know, and I really appreciate Ms. Agnew's open-mindedness and hearing me, but I just want to make sure we talk about that here and encapsulate that. Not that I want it to be a major expansion, but I think 1% seems low to me, because I think that there's some greater possibilities that would be possible, and we talked about that, but I wanted to say that out loud, because the other thing that is on my mind, here I go, is that, you know, our roads, the arteries, when you think about the Kingston and its traffic patterns and flows, and when you go right around the clock kind of thing and see how everybody comes in and out and leaves our city, it's quite fascinating. And there's a lot of arteries from Highway 2, both sides.
30 seconds.
Coming up. And so it's very important that we think about our arteries and managing that flow and how we're going to accommodate that in the years to come. So we can talk about that, I suppose. What was the other thing, Len? I told you about that. And anyways, thank you for that. I just wonder, like, if their arteries are full now coming in from Kingston's attractive to the outlying area, and that's something, whether it's Sealy's Bay and Brockville and Napanee, and we need to consider
That's
the
been
greater
5 minutes now.
community's impact. Thank you very much.
Is there a response, or no? I think that was just mostly a statement. Is there anybody else who wishes to speak? Seeing as none. So now we're going to move on to the public portion of the meeting. So you can come to the microphone over here. You'll have 5 minutes to speak, and you have to state your name and address for the record.
My name is Julia Barron, 1307 Butternut Creek Road in Kingston, the former Pittsburgh Township. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. I am wishing to share with the members here recent experience. As we all know, Toronto experienced significant flooding this past summer. I unfortunately was in Toronto at that time and was experienced the difficulty managing the roads during that flood. The report you have presented tonight is concise. I am wondering, since Kingston was one of the first municipalities to declare a climate emergency in Ontario, if there has been consideration given regarding the flooding and potential climate changes, with rainfalls being much more significant than in previous decades and anticipated to get much worse in future, whether with development proceeding, proposed development proceeding, whether the opportunity with Utilities Kingston, with various environmental agencies, the water that congregates, we've already seen during significant rainfalls on Gardner's Road, on King Street. Those of us who have lived here during and worked here during those times of significant precipitation. Has a study been done for water mitigation as we progress with further development?
Okay, is there anyone else who wishes to speak? There's no one else in the room. Is there anyone on Zoom that wishes to speak?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, we do have some members of the public in attendance online. If you would like to speak to this item, please use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. I do see that Isabelle has her hand raised, so I will allow her to speak.
Hello, you have 5 minutes and you have to state your name and address for the record.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Isabelle Crack and I live at 111 Markland Drive, Kingston East. I have a couple of questions. So a basic map was included in the package and you've already shown it on screen without reference for the the Kingston East and Kingston West expansion areas. There's no reference to any protected areas or heritage landmarks. And so my question would be twofold. What do you consider the definition of natural heritage features? It's in this report, and there's no definition. And I think that actually might be very helpful, not just to the public, but to council itself. Does this include, for instance, natural waterways and forests? And also, currently, would protected areas that have already been identified and are showing on a particular Kingston map that I have in front of me, it's not in your package, as protected, would those form part of that natural heritage feature already? And lastly, I just would like to know, will the process of considering changes to any of those heritage features, as you're talking about, just absolutely just taking these areas and including them in the urban environment, would there be any changes as to how a heritage feature is declared? And is it will it be as stringent a process as it currently is in the permit process request? I hope I've been clear. If you need me to be clear, please let me know.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else on Zoom that wishes to speak?
I do not see anybody else with their hand raised, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I'll turn to staff to answer the public's questions.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the questions and comments. With respect to the first set of comments about whether a study has been done with respect to water mitigation, I'm not aware of that study, but I'm happy to follow up and get back to you at a later time. Also, the new official plan will be considering climate change, like as we draft the policy, so we are going to be looking at all of the policies through a climate lens. The second set of questions were around protected areas. So actually, I was just pulling up the definition of natural heritage features in our official plan. Sorry, just give me one minute. Okay. So the natural heritage features and areas are defined as features and areas including significant wetlands, significant coastal wetlands, other coastal wetlands, fish habitat, waters supporting aquatic species at risk, significant woodlands, significant valley lands, habitat of endangered species and threatened species, significant wildlife habitat, and significant areas of natural and scientific interest, which are important for their environmental and social values as a legacy of the natural landscapes of an area. In terms of the process for determining these features, the city is initiating a natural heritage study, which will include mapping of these features. Our current official plan does include mapping showing these features, but that mapping was based on the natural heritage study that was completed in 2006. So as part of this new official plan process, we are looking to update that information. Some of the boundaries for the provincially significant features come from the province, so the city is required to use those boundaries, but a lot of the features that are locally important and locally significant, those will be mapped through this natural heritage study.
Okay, thank you. So now we'll move on to having a mover and a seconder. Moved by Councillor Shaves, seconded by Councillor Osanek. Is there any discussion? Seeing as none, all in favor? And that passes unanimously. Okay, so now the next item is a recommendation report for 2312 Princess Street, and I invite staff to introduce the report.
All right. Now, good evening, and through the chair, my name is Ian Clendenning, a senior planner with the City of Kingston, and tonight I'm presenting a supplemental report regarding revisions to an official plan and zoning bylaw amendment for the property located at 2312 Princess Street. The purpose and effect of the proposed amendments are to permit a new 6-story mid-rise apartment building having a 4-story base floor plate and step-backs in its building height, which is intended to accommodate 302 new rental homes. The revised proposal has been amended to leave the designation and zoning of the heritage lands unchanged, and the existing policies and regulations will continue to apply. The site is located within the Princess Street intensification corridor and is well serviced by express and regular transit, as well as bicycle infrastructure, while existing commercial and institutional offerings, including grocery, retail, and restaurants, provide access to both amenities and jobs for area residents. The application was last heard at the Planning Committee meeting of December 7th, 2024, where the committee deferred a decision to allow staff additional time to have conversations around compatibility considerations with the residents and the developer. Since that time, the applicant has submitted a revised proposal and hosted an additional community consultation meeting. Based on the correspondence received, several areas of interest remain at issue, including shadows, loss of privacy overlook, massing height, traffic, noise, and drainage. Providing an overview of the changes, the east wing of the building, illustrated in red here, is to be recessed 1 meter lower based on a revised grading plan. At the west wing of the building, the applicant has increased the setback a distance of 2 meters for a total of 14.5 meters from the north property line. I will note that the revised proposal includes a fire access route intended to meet the requirements of the Ontario Building Code. As before, language of the bylaw prevents this feature from serving as a driveway, which was one concern raised by the community. I will also note that the draft bylaw has also been revised to remove reference to a 1-meter fence, as fencing already exists along the property line and is, in fact, a requirement under the subdivision agreement, and those owners install and maintain this feature. The applicant remains responsible for providing a vegetative buffer which will maintain the impact of the massing of the building and overlook and privacy concerns, especially over the longer term where the trees will grow to maturity. Based on designs submitted by the applicant, the vegetative buffer is intended to accommodate a variety of coniferous and deciduous trees, which, when fully grown, would range from 15 to 25 meters in height, which many of these trees would exceed the maximum height of the building at its 6-story location. At the 5th story, the applicant has attempted to mitigate the overlook concerns through the inclusion of a 1.2-meter separating feature between the building wall and the rooftop terrace. This is in addition to all the aforementioned mitigation measures. The revised submission did propose to increase the extent of balconies and to provide variously projecting balconies, shown in red at the 2nd and 3rd floor, and a recessed balcony at the 4th floor. Previously, only Juliet balconies were proposed above the 2nd story. I will note here that staff are not supporting of the exterior balconies above the 2nd story along the north wall. As such, the draft bylaw prohibits these outdoor balconies with the exception of the 1st and 2nd floor. As noted, staff are not in a position to support the projecting balconies above the 2nd story. While not part of this application, the applicant has submitted a site plan control application with more details and designs to initiate a thorough review in the hopes of obtaining planning approvals. The graphics above show how the applicant intends to address not having projecting balconies by reorienting each of the corner units, circled in red, to have east and west facing balconies rather than north facing balconies, which greatly reduces the extent of impact, especially at the west wing where no balconies would project to the north. Of course, the bottom illustration shows only Juliet's facing to the north. The top image here shows the view from Anderson Drive with the enhanced 14.5 meter setback depicted at the upper left. The lower image shows the site's north elevation looking downwards towards Princess, facing the as it faces the residential lots with the proposed Juliet balconies above the second story. Here, the profile sections show how a 45-degree angular plane are generally met or exceeded. This is a tool frequently used as a measure of appropriate transition between higher and lower density areas. While shadows do vary around the year, the above images show the impact at around 3 p.m. Full shadow impacts are provided in the exhibits, and I note that winter is generally not factored into these types of reviews. There is a minor increase resulting from more accurate information provided by the applicant. In certain conditions referenced in the report, that would be about 6 meters. In the event of approval, the development would be subject to site plan control. Community benefits charges would be applicable for the apartment building. Oops, my apologies. Thank you for your time, and I would be happy to answer any questions the committee might have.
Are there any questions from the committee? Councillor Shaves.
Thank you. I don't think this will be as long as the last time we were here in December 23. Maybe only one round. There's still concerns brought forward in regards to drainage and flooding that has occurred in the past. Is the applicant responsible for those?
Thank you. Through the chair, one of the primary considerations, one of many anyhow, is the controlling of drainage as a result of further development. That's one item that our engineering team reviews to ensure compliance with the law, which would be that there is no net increase in drainage. I can say anecdotally that during the community consultation, the owner did indicate an interest of working collegially with area residents in the efforts of further improving the existing situation. While I can't use that as a commitment, I would like to reference that.
Okay, but they're not responsible for anything that happened prior to the purchase of that lot, correct?
Through the chair, I would not understand that the historic drainage would be the existing owner's responsibility. However, as noted, the subdivision agreement of the lands north would be tied to their own stormwater management controls. That would have factored in making sure that through the subdivision process, they are not negatively impacting the current lot, and nor would they allow for an increase in flows of the future subdivision lot. Of course, adherence to those plans would be the owner's responsibility.
And can you confirm, is there a drainage plan in place presented by the applicant in this file?
I have personally looked at the drainage plans for the residential subdivision.
Okay. And what assurances do residents have that this will be followed through, like on the city's behalf?
Through the chair, Councillor, could you please repeat that question?
Just what assurance do residents have that the drainage plan and that no excess water would be going into their properties?
That's a great question. In part, it is through the commitment of our professionals at city staff that review the engineered drawings provided by the applicant, but ultimately it would be perhaps a matter of law.
Okay. Is there also a monetary amount that the applicant has to place in order to be placed on hold until the site plan is actually approved by the city?
Thank you. Through the chair, the bylaw as drafted does remove the hold. Of course, they would be fulfilling all site plan requirements, which is one of the conditions of the my apologies. Yeah, through the chair for that misunderstanding. Yes, they would be required to pay securities, which is based on the extent of work.
Okay, thank you. So moving on from there, I did see the landscaping plan that was suggested, but I'm just also wondering, this also includes pollinator-friendly shrubbery or plants.
Through the chair, yes, I focused primarily on the buffer area to the north. They are proposing extensive vegetation throughout, and that would generally speaking be administered through the site plan control bylaw as well as our trees bylaw. Pollinator friendly, I would have to look at the documents.
It's something I'd like to present, so if they're listening. And how close to net zero would this project be?
Thanks, and through you, Chair. The applicants haven't submitted for their building permit yet. I know this developer does tend to build to the National Building Code, which has a greater green target associated with it, but they haven't started to prepare the building permit yet. Their representation is here tonight and listening, so they have heard the question, but unfortunately don't have an answer for you specifically on what would be deployed on this site for green building initiatives.
Okay, because I understand the normal replies and it being the multi-residential, more condensed, and everything else along that line. I'm just wondering if they're superseding those maximums or criterias or the minimums. In regards to, now, if there's a request, is there a possibility, of course this isn't going, I only get 30 seconds each time. There's more to the applicant. If there's a request or a need, would there be a possibility of the residents developing a community garden on the property?
Thanks, and through you, Chair, they are listening tonight. There is always an ability to have a community garden associated with any application, especially this one here. They do have outside landscaped green open space, so it's a possibility. There's no restriction in the zoning bylaw or the site plan control agreement that would prohibit such an activity from taking place on a property.
Okay, thank you. And I did notice that there is a slight conflict in regards to the applicant's proposal and the staff's recommendation in the bylaw in regards to balconies and Juliet balconies, which I know is one of the main sticking points. But just to confirm, right now, according to the bylaw and the proposed plan, only Juliet balconies on the north-facing wall.
Thank you. Through the chair, at this moment, the applicant does have the right of appeal based on the failure to make a decision with the prescribed timelines. Should this committee and subsequently council approve a bylaw that does not give that applicant the full suite of options that they initially came to us with, they would have the right to appeal the decision or accept the compromise. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, but also according to one of the slides, the applicant has also proposed east and west balconies on the corners and Juliet's on the north.
Through the chair, that does indicate a level of commitment to accepting this plan, but ultimately I couldn't provide certainty until the appeal period expires.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. I'll have comments later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak to this file? Seeing as none. Oh, Councillor Osanek.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. It's good to see that there's going to be trees planted for that vegetated buffer. How has the applicant was there any discussion about how the trees can be ensured to survive?
Through the chair, and perhaps Mr. Barr could confirm this, but that would form part of the securities. Of course, there is an amount of tree clearing going on the property, and with that, we are able to use the tree bylaw to, at a minimum, enforce the replacement of those, as well, of course, with the built-in provisions of the zoning bylaw that require that 2-meter strip of vegetation. Of course, this committee would be aware that the site plan control process does not have the legislative authority to implement that, but thankfully we do have other tools.
Thanks, and through you, Chair, just to supplement that, because they do have a vegetative buffer along the north lot line that's required by the zoning, we will be capturing that in the site plan control agreement. And because it's in the site plan control agreement, even post-security release, they have a contractual obligation to maintain that vegetative buffer. So we have an ability to continue to enforce upon any sort of trees that do not survive along that north lot line to have them replaced and that vegetative buffer remain.
Okay, anyone else have any questions? Seeing as none, so I will invite the public to speak if they have any questions. Are the members of the public here to speak to this file? Is there anyone online?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, there are members online. I will allow Mary to speak.
State your name and address, and you have 5 minutes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Did you hear my name and address? I got a message here saying I was muted.
Yeah, no, we didn't hear that.
Okay, can I start again? Because I got a message saying that
Yeah,
you couldn't hear me.
Yeah, no, I'll start the timer when you state your name and address.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Mary O'Brien and Grant McDonald, homeowners of 163 Ellesmere Avenue, whose property backs directly onto the north side of this proposal. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this evening. We do recognize that there is a need for increased housing in our municipality and elsewhere, and we also understand that the city considers it suitable to create needed housing along main thoroughfares with existing transit routes while keeping this objective in mind. It is the immense size, density, and height of this proposal that provides the most concern. We acknowledge that much discussion and some welcomed alterations have transpired over time regarding the potential design of this project, but we feel it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that adjacent residents remain vigilant about expressing lingering concerns. Of course, our original true desire is to keep the current designation of this property intact as arterial commercial and low-density residential, which still allows for some new housing. However, considering the possibility that the current zoning and bylaws do not remain intact, our goal naturally remains to minimize the negative impacts on the long-existing neighborhood as much as possible. This is what has driven our conversations. Privacy, compatibility, and shadowing have long been our key points of concern. New alterations, like pushing back the footprint of some of the closest north-facing walls from our property lines by an additional 2 meters, for a total of 14.4 now, and lowering the grade at the northeast end only by 1 meter are welcomed adjustments. However, without lowering the grade of the entire first floor, it is evident in the newest solar study reports that this will definitely increase shadowing for longer periods, and the building will sadly tower over our bungalows even more. However, as a measure to increase privacy, we commend and support the enforcement of Planning Services' proposed bylaw to allow only Juliet-style balconies above the second floor on the north-facing wall. The balcony coverage of that north wall has most recently been requested by the developer to be increased from 30% to 57%, and that amount of overlook is excessive. And with the new proposal of choosing some of the corner units and changing the orientation of the balcony, those number of units is still extremely minimal compared to the overall number of 20-plus balconies on that north wall. It is difficult not to compare what was deemed acceptable by the Planning Department and the Planning Committee for this same developer's recent building at 2274 Princess Street, ironically situated within the same block as this proposal. That first one has 4 to 5 stories, depending on the section of the structure, and Juliet balconies facing north. This new one is planned to be 6 floors in most parts, with double the depth of underground parking. This indicates to us that it will presumably take ages beyond the first building's timeline to be constructed, which is already 2+ years and still appears to be unfinished. Thus, an even greater number of months and years of relentless combination of blasting and construction noise within very close proximity will be endured by many in the Walnut Grove community. For many of its residents, any escape from the weekday onslaught of such conditions is very limited or non-existent. In summary, this enormous project is plainly out of proportion in regard to the surrounding residences and to the scale of the building property itself. We support the requirement of only Juliet balconies on all northernmost walls to reduce the concerns of privacy and noise. We respectfully ask that the city planners, the planning committee, the developer take our concerns into further consideration while weighing this application for yet another massive apartment building on our block. It will be situated in an established residential community which has already been severely impacted by intensification as a result of the property at 2274 Princess Street. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else on Zoom that wishes to speak?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I will recognize Catherine.
Please state your name and address for the record, please. And you have 5 minutes.
My name is Catherine Caesar. My husband, Felix Caesar, and I live at 155 Ellesmere Avenue. We have lived here for the last 20 years. I have no objections, none whatsoever, to the City of Kingston increasing the number of housing units available for residents. My past employment include working with Canada Mortgage and Housing for several years. So I'm familiar with affordable housing. I'm familiar with studies done to increase housing, which provides for those that need assistance in housing and those that don't. My concern here is the size of this building. In addition to what Mary already said, my concern is also the traffic study that I have not heard anything about a traffic study done. We already are experiencing a significant increase of traffic in the area. My concern is also, in particular, with the fencing. If there is a building of that magnitude being constructed behind us with the Walnut Grove residents have a fence, it's a wooden fence that's 20 years old. And as I understand it, the Walnut Grove residents are responsible for their fences, to maintain the fences. A building of that magnitude, a construction taking place behind us, is going to destroy the fence that's already there. 20 years old wooden fence. And I would like to see the builder be responsible for putting up a decent fence that between the residents of Walnut Grove and their property. I'm also concerned about the vegetative buffer. It takes 20, I have a maple tree behind my house. I planted it, and it took 20 years to get to where it is today. The trees that the developer intends to plant will take at least 20 years to provide the buffer that we're looking at in the pictures. Let's not fool ourselves. In Kingston, the trees don't grow that fast. We won't have a buffer in 10 years. So I would like to see something more done in place of those trees to provide us with some privacy and to remove that shadowing that is going to be, that will be in place as a result of the size of the building. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else wishes to speak?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll just give the rest of the members attending online a couple of minutes to raise hand. And I'm not seeing any movement.
Okay, so I'll turn it over to staff to see if they have any comments. I'm not entirely sure there was a specific question. I guess there was one or two. Yeah.
No, thank you. And through the chair, I believe that I can capture most of the issues and questions that were identified. You know, I want to start with a giant thank you to Mary and all the residents that went to work with the city and, you know, coming out to these community consultation meetings. In respect to the construction timing, I'll just start with that item and how it's possible that a construction activity might extend over a variety of time. Now, generally speaking, that is not a land use planning concern. My sympathies, I have construction that I can hear off in the distance, and I'm sure that that's an unfortunate thing that they can be anticipating. But with respect to land use planning, where we do have to accommodate growth, blasting is regulated provincially. We have a site alteration bylaw that can help manage these things, but ultimately it is a landowner's right to construct in accordance with bylaws. So I had also highlighted some elements about the balconies, and what I can say is that the 53% of all north-facing balconies was calculated at an aggregate level, including the ones furthest south, where the applicant has really done their drawings, I would understand, to provide balconies to as many residential units as possible. I think there's just a few, and perhaps the applicant's planner could tell me specifically, to provide balconies at every unit, just recognizing his clientele. So ultimately, by the move, where at the north, they have moved the corner suites balconies to project east and west, that is now effectively a 0% at the northwest section. And while I admit that I have not run the calculations based on their site plan control drawings, you know, if we wish to pull up the drawings that show the site plan as submitted, really there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 units that have balconies facing north. And again, that's just on the first and second floor, the remainder being Juliet, even those projecting east and west rather than north and south on those corner suites. Between that and highlighting the transition with the building achieving a 45-degree angular plane, and I'm going to circle over to the comment raised by the other resident with respect to trees. And it is accepted that trees start small and grow large over the longer term. That is planning in essence. I am tempted to say that the subdivision there is somewhere to the effect of 20 to 30 years old, suggesting that the trees in their backyards, which I've seen and are growing to maturity, provide quite a buffer for those that do have trees in their backyards. And the vegetative buffer provided by the applicant will only enhance that. I do believe that another issue that was spoken to was the item of fencing. And speaking to that, while the applicant is not proposing to replace at their cost the existing fence, I would understand that it falls to just common law. You are not allowed to push over somebody's fence. And to the extent that you do, that would be a civil matter that the courts could readily, I would assume, rectify. I think that with that knowledge, the developer will proactively either try to not have a negative impact on that fence or make appropriate planning to replace it if their machinery does destroy the neighbor's private property. The last item that one of the last, I think second to last, and I'll circle back to something, is the traffic study, which the applicant has in fact submitted. It was not required to be revised based on the new proposal, which maintained effectively the same building, just at a different location, trying to minimize that extent of overlook and massing. But the traffic is essentially the same, and we would review a detailed traffic impact study during the site plan control process. I can say that they have a right-in, right-out only proposed at Princess Street. That's going to minimize the impact of, say, left-turning traffic from the development onto Princess Street. They have full movement access onto Anderson, but this was thoroughly reviewed by city staff. And Princess Street, I will just highlight, is an arterial planned to accommodate these types of volumes, and development charges are planned to be used that this building would be payable for to increase the capacity of our road network in accordance with the development charges background study. And then finally, I think that I've hit on these issues, but that of the general size and massing of the building. And circling back to how we talked about the 45-degree angular plane, how in the fall, summer, and spring, the shadows are, broadly speaking, maintained onto the applicant's property, with the exception of minor shadows which track across those residential lots to the north during not the summer, but the fall and spring equinox. For all those reasons, I believe that this is appropriate, and that it's my staff's recommendation for approval.
Okay, thank you very much. So now I will turn it over to the committee for a mover and a seconder. Moved by Councillor Shave, seconded by Councillor Oosterhoff. Is there any discussion? Councillor Saves.
Thank you. I know I speak freely here in that this has been a very contentious file, to the point numerous questions asked back in December of last year, and staff decided to pull it off the agenda and go back to the applicant and the residents in regards to this. I do want to commend both, residents, applicant, and staff and all they've done in the past year in order to get us to this point. This is not going to be a project that's going to make everyone happy, but maybe it's to the point that it can be accepted. I know the biggest bone of contention, not just where it sits in the property line, but the overlook is one of the biggest issues. And I do think that has been a compromise done on this file. And with everything else that's been planned and the assurances, I believe I'm at the point that I can accept this proposal as it sits now. So, thank you.
Councillor Oosterhoff.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would agree with my last statements of my colleague, and yeah, I think there's been a lot of really good things to develop this property. May I still ask a couple of questions, Mr. Chair?
Yes?
Oh, when I do really understand the one constituent's concern about the trees, and is there anything at any time that drives, or is it up to the developer to choose a more mature tree to give it a head start? Like basically you can go to a 15-foot tree and save 5 years. Like, is that something that is up to, like in this circumstance, it would seem very respectful of the community, that the proximity, but there's no way we can drive that. Is that correct to the staff?
Thanks, and through you, Chair. We were just taking a look at the landscape plan, and typically trees, when they come in, they're about 4 or 5 feet tall. But when looking at the landscape plan, they're already proposing trees that will be 2 meters in height.
Okay.
And so from there, they're getting a good head start. And because the landscape buffer is both in the zoning and part of the site plan control agreement, it gives actually the city the broad ability to enforce any non-compliance, both through the zoning bylaw and the site plan control agreement. So the trees will definitely get a more of a head start than you see some other places. But again, that's a bit of a long-term game, and planning is a bit of a long-term vision. So, we plant these landscape buffers with the understanding that through time they will grow to their full extent, but, continuously provide mitigation as they grow out.
Yeah, thank you for that. Mr. Chair, I was just wondering one more time, we did hear that there is access from this parking lot to Anderson, which will give people the opportunity to turn left at controlled traffic lights. That's the key component to traffic management there. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that is correct. There is what we would call full turn movements at Anderson.
Yeah, thank you. That makes that's a real bonus for residents and everyone there. And I wanted to ask one last question. One of the reasons this all kind of got delayed too, or reworked, was the heritage property there. I'm pleased with what I see. I think it's done really well. But do we speak to that at all, or is that heritage property obviously is not necessarily in the scope, but it impacted it? So everything is golden, so to speak, now with that property, and it can exist and be functional with everything we've got happening here, correct?
Thanks, and through you, Chair, yes, the heritage property will continue to have a suite of commercial and mixed uses associated with it, with the zoning that it has in place. It's not forming part of this application because it's not being considered for the broad residential uses that are proposed here, but it will continue to provide the functions that it's zoned for in the commercial arterial area. So it's not being severed off or isolated to be forgotten. It's still going to have a continuous uses, and its access will be from Anderson Street as well. So we'll make use of existing internal driveway configurations.
Yeah, no, I'm pleased by that. I kind of figured that. I commend everybody involved, and I'm sure the owner as well, and the neighborhood and everyone to make this happen. Hopefully they can get it going really soon and help meet the incredible needs for housing in our community. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to comment, or seeing as no one? All in favor? That passes. Okay, so moving on. So there are no motions, there are no notices of motions. Is there any other business? No. There is no, there was correspondence, wasn't there? Yeah. So the date of the next meeting of the Planning Committee is scheduled for Thursday, October 10th, 2024 at 6 p.m. Do I have a mover and seconder for adjournment? Moved by Councillor Shave, seconded by Councillor Oosterhoff. All in favor? And have a good night, everyone.